Good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson tonight. It's becoming clear that a long trail of official negligence led to the Valentine's Day school shooting in Parkland, Florida. School officials failed, so did the FBI, but Broward County Sheriff Scott Israel has a distinguished record of exceptional ineptitude and arrogance. Under Israel's leadership, Broward deputies ignored repeated warnings about Nicholas Cruz's violent behavior. The department received at least 23 calls about Cruz or his family. In one call last November, a tipster specifically warned that Nicholas Cruz was, quote, a school shooter in the making, which of course turned out to be sadly true. Sheriff Israel did nothing. Under Israel's leadership, the department entered an agreement to drastically reduce student arrests. The goal was to eliminate the so-called school-to-prison pipeline, which at the time was a top priority of President Obama and Attorney General Eric Holder. The effect was a disaster. Cruz might have been arrested and convicted of a crime. Were it not for that policy, he would never have been able to buy a gun. Once the Parkland shooting began, Israel's deputies refused their most basic duties. Deputy Scott Peterson, whose only job was to protect students at the school, hid while Cruz murdered 17 people. When 3 more Broward deputies arrived, they too took shelter behind their cars rather than try and enter the school and save the lives of children. Scott Israel is the man in charge of all of this, and of course he's responsible for it. He loudly disagrees. Indeed, Israel relentlessly brags about himself to all media who will record it. 2 years ago, for example, the local newspaper in Florida reported that Israel used tax dollars to build a personal political machine, and he clearly had. The evidence was there, stone cold. Confronted with it, Israel said this, quote, "What have I done differently than Don Shula or Abraham Lincoln or Martin Luther King or Gandhi?" End quote. And by the way, he said, lions don't care about the opinions of sheep. Stable people don't talk like this, obviously. Something is wrong with Sheriff Israel. As recently as yesterday, he was refusing to accept any responsibility in the face of his well-documented failures. Watch this exchange.
Do you think that if the Broward Sheriff's Office had done things differently, this shooting might not have happened?
Listen, if ifs and buts were candy and nuts, O.J. Simpson would still be in the record books.
I don't know what that means. There's 17 dead people, and there's a whole long list of things your department could have done differently.
Remarkably, it got weirder and worse from there. Watch.
Are you really not taking any responsibility for the multiple red flags that were brought to the attention of the Broward Sheriff's Office about this shooter before the incident, whether it was people near him, close to him, calling the police on him?
Jake, I could only take responsibility for what I knew about. I exercised my due diligence. I've given amazing leadership to this agency.
Amazing leadership?
I've worked. Yes, Jake.
Amazing leadership. And yet the facts suggest that Scott Israel should not be in charge of anything, and yet he is. Why? Richard Corcoran is the Speaker of the Florida House. He signed a letter calling for Israel's suspension as Sheriff of Broward County, and he joins us tonight. Mr. Speaker, thanks for coming on.
No, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it, Tucker.
So tell us what your letter says and why.
Well, and first, it wasn't just a letter from me. It was a letter from me and 73 of my colleagues, basically representatives accountable for 13+ million people in the state of Florida. And what we sent a letter to the governor saying, under the Constitution, he has the right to remove any local government official, suspend them, and take them out of office. And we said, basically, your authority to do so is if there are malfeasance, misfeasance, incompetence, neglect of duty, of which we believe that Sheriff Israel scores high on all 4 accounts. So we asked him to suspend him and go down there and take over the investigation and find a replacement. And so 74 of us signed it. The governor immediately, to his credit, called on FDLE, our state law enforcement agency, to go down there and seize the investigation and take over. But we'd still like to see him suspended by the governor, and then ultimately our Florida Senate has the ability to reinstate him or have him be removed completely. And I'm pretty sure, talking to my colleagues in the Senate, they'd remove him completely.
So my guess would be, of the 74 signatories, most or all were Republicans, which raises the question, why is this a partisan issue? So he had 4 deputies with guns at the scene of a school shooting and they refused to help. That's not a partisan question. You don't need to be a Republican to be appalled by that. Why did no Democrats support his removal?
Well, I think we do have the support. It's very difficult, I think, for some of them because many of them are from that geographical area of Broward County.
Right.
A significant portion of our Democratic colleagues. So I think for them, it was like, you're right, go forward. We encourage you. But, signing the the letter was something that was a step too far for them. But they're completely supportive. Whether it's the parents I've talked to of the victims, whether it's our colleagues across the aisle, everyone's disgusted with both his attitude and the investigation and what he's been doing to date.
So my impression is that the deputies who sat outside armed while 17 people were murdered at the school were within their legal rights. They were allowed to do that. Most of us respect law enforcement because we think they're willing to put their lives on the line for us. These people weren't. That seems to me maybe something that the legislature could address. If you're a deputy in charge of protecting the public, shouldn't you be obligated to protect the public?
Yeah, and let me say, Tucker, and I think you would say the same thing. I'm an outside counsel for a sheriff's office as part of my job as an attorney. I can tell you the sheriff's a friend of mine. I know tons of law enforcement officers. Not one single law enforcement officer that I know in that situation wouldn't have gone scrambling into that hallway, up the stairways, whatever it took to try to save those children. What we have here is a poorly run agency. And whether it was the officer on site or the three that came in the car or the officers that went out to his house, as you said, 23 times and never did anything even though he was a threat, whether it was the deal that he entered into with the superintendent of schools that basically said we're going to have a no arrest policy so he can bring guns and knives and bullets to school, all of these things. And the funny thing is this is by his own words. What Sheriff Israel said is in each one of those situations, the officers outside, the school resource officer inside, the people inside who denied first responders the ability to go help these kids, the agreement and those bullets coming to school. He's got every single person under investigation, but he just want to hold himself accountable for all these people that he has to investigate for their wrongdoing, but he's done none. And the height of arrogance, as you said, Tucker. I mean, the only amazing thing about Sheriff Israel is his arrogance.
I mean, something's wrong, it seems like. This is not normal behavior. But quickly, in the military, there's a sanction, a penalty for cowardice, because the point is you're not allowed to be a coward. You're in the military, and I think the same would go, wouldn't you say, for a sheriff's deputy or any law enforcement? Most aren't cowards, but for those who are, shouldn't there be some penalty for that?
There should. I mean, we should look at taking away their pensions. If you don't act the way you should in a situation where there are 14 children's lives at stake and 3 adults, absolutely, you should have your pension taken away.
Yeah, good. Thank you for that. Speaker Corcoran, I appreciate coming on tonight.
No, thanks. I appreciate it. Thank you, Tucker.
Well, as you just heard, EMTS are telling Fox tonight that police officers prevented them, for some reason, from entering Stoneman Douglas High School to provide care to kids who were dying. Fox's Matt Finn has new exclusive information on that story tonight. Matt?
Tucker, 3 high-ranking Florida officials are expressing their frustration because they say EMS was delayed getting inside Stoneman Douglas High School on the day of the shooting in the critical moments when victims lay inside in need of immediate care. One source tells Fox News some EMS teams requested to go inside but were denied by the commanding agency, the Broward County Sheriff's Office. That source alleges scanner recordings will reveal that. Now, the Broward County Sheriff's Office released a statement in response to some of these allegations, saying in part there are multiple investigations being conducted in addition to the Stoneman Douglas shooting. Investigators will not be rushed or asked to jump to conclusions. A reporter from our Miami affiliate WSVN reports that a seasoned first responder said they would have risked their life to go inside and that they were frustrated the entire time they were there. However, the Coral Springs Parkland fire chief, who was on scene that day, says it is procedure that EMS cannot go inside until law enforcement clears them to enter. The fire chief says law enforcement could not initially confirm if the suspect fled or was deceased, making it too dangerous to let EMS inside. That fire chief telling Fox News in part, decisions cannot be made in a vacuum. It is possible that those that are upset about not being allowed inside simply do not have all of the information that our law enforcement partners had in making their decision. The Florida Department of Law Enforcement is investigating all the actions by the Broward County Sheriff, which will hopefully shed light on the timeline of that day.
I know a lot more than you all do now. So all I'm going to say is, yes, I believe there needs to be a full investigation. I don't think some people were honest. And we're going to investigate this in Florida, and the right thing will be done.
Tucker, a rules committee in the Florida Senate today voted down a proposal on a statewide ban on assault weapons here in Florida. Tucker.
Matt, thanks a lot. Sheriff Scott Israel would never blame his own repeated failures for the shooting at Stoneman Douglas High School. Instead, he needed to blame an organization that was not involved, the NRA. During CNN's 1984-esque town hall meeting last week, Israel played the demagogue against NRA spokeswoman Dana Lash. Watch.
You just told this group of people that you are standing up for them. You're not standing up for them until you say, I want less weapons.
Dana Lash joins us tonight. Dana, when I was watching that, my first thought was he doesn't sound much like a sheriff. He sounds like someone running for office, a Tammany politician, a red-faced blowhard, a demagogue. It doesn't sound like something a law enforcement official would say in a town hall. What do you make of that?
I completely agree with you, Tucker, and I'm so glad that you're talking about this, because this is the failure, and this is where the failure took place. It was with this man and his leadership as Broward County Sheriff. And I'll have everybody know, Tucker, as well, before the sheriff took that stage, him and I sitting up there for this town hall, he was allowed to go out and give a rally-style speech in which he railed against special interests and was naming the NRA and really setting the stage up to go after 5 million law-abiding innocent Americans who didn't get all of the 45, I think is what BuzzFeed reported, tips that his office received. They didn't have the murderer calling his office himself, telling him that he thought he was a threat and that police needed to do something. Family members weren't calling the NRA reporting this. They were calling his office. And so he has a lot of explaining to do. And one more quick thing, Tucker. I asked the sheriff on stage whether or not he could have actually arrested this murderer based on a Florida state statute that treated anyone sending electronic or written threats of bodily injury, harm, or death to other individuals, as this murderer did with his classmates, whether he could have arrested that individual charged with a felony. And the sheriff did indicate that he could, but then he glossed right by it and wanted to refocus and shift responsibility away from his dereliction of duty. I think he owes a lot of innocent Americans an apology.
Well, but it's also really troubling because, I mean, this guy's not a congressman from Camden. He has the power to put people in jail, to take their lives away from them. He's a law enforcement official, and this behavior seems reckless and dishonest and weird, comparing yourself to, to MLK and Gandhi. I mean, does it seem like there's something wrong with him?
And, you know, you mentioned that Game of Thrones quote, the lion doesn't worry about the opinions of the sheep. Well, he mentioned that again yesterday in a radio interview with a South Florida station, and he was attacking all of those, including the congressman that you just had on, the lawmaker that you just had on, the state of Florida, who was calling for his resignation. And, you know, I agree with you. I wish that this would have come out on the stage. I wish that this truth would have been known at that particular time. It seemed as that he was more interested in turning this into a campaign stop. And I will say that this really explains why the Coral Springs police chief came out against the Broward County sheriff the way that they did. They said in a statement that the truth is going to come out because Coral Springs police reacted. They were the first ones in, and they seem to be really calling the Broward sheriff out on what I can only assume to be showboating was what they were suggesting in their letter. And there had to be a lot of drama behind the scenes for other law enforcement officers who really, I mean, these are the guys who, I mean, they sacrificed. They ran in. They heard the sound of gunfire and screaming, Tucker, and they ran in and they did what they could to save innocents. That's why we love our law enforcement, because of what they do for us. And now it's no wonder that they came out against this Broward County sheriff.
It's also transparent, though. I mean, I'm not blaming the shooting on the sheriff. He didn't commit the shooting, but a series of missteps by his agency allowed it to happen. He's culpable in some way, and yet he's diverting all the attention to others. It's the most basic and recognizable kind of butt covering. Why does the press not point that out?
I wish they would. I mean, what we're talking about is systemic failure here. And Tucker, I mean, here you had the 45 reports into this sheriff's office. You also had 2 FBI reports. But even bigger than that, we've had decades of the political class ignoring the mental health crisis here in the United States, and politicians who have refused to report dangerous people who are been adjudicated unfit, dangerous to themselves or others, to the NICS system. And so this is why we at the NRA have been pushing for targeted action and offering solutions on this. And we're going to continue to do so.
Yeah. So if you run a city with tens of thousands of mentally ill people living on the sidewalk and you're lecturing us about guns, you know, maybe it's time to wake up a little bit. Thank you, Dana. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Tucker.
Well, in the days since the Florida school massacre, almost nobody seems to be asking the essential and obvious question, which is, why would a 19-year-old murder strangers? And if you really wanted to make America better, you'd be desperate for an answer to that question. But go ahead and ask an elected Democrat. that question. We've tried that, and they won't engage. You start with the obvious. Does the collapse of the family play some role in this? I don't know. Good question. Silence. Single mothers are one of the Democratic Party's most important constituencies. They can't admit that disappearance of fathers at home has been a disaster. It has been. How about the overprescription of pharmaceuticals to kids, or violent media, the sudden omnipresence of soul-destroying technology in our lives? It's everywhere. They won't even respond to that. All those explanations might make Democratic donors uncomfortable. That's the answer. So instead, they attack the NRA because it's politically convenient. The NRA opposes them in elections. Therefore, it's their fault. It's hard to think of a more cynical strategy, and yet it's working. Using their propaganda arm in the American media, the Democratic Party has succeeded in bullying Republican leaders into making pointless concessions on gun control, including the president, by the way. Banning bump stocks is going to solve the problem? Does anyone really think that? Not one person really thinks that. But that's been the compromise. Have you seen Democrats compromise in any way at all? Have you seen a single Democrat concede that the rise in school massacres may be related to something other than guns and the NRA? Nope. Because the point is not to make schools safer. The point is to win power. That ought to be clear. By the way, as to why this is happening in the first place, Jordan Peterson joins us later in the show with his views on it. Fascinating. Mayor of Oakland, California, collaborating with illegal immigrants to undermine America's own laws. Not making that up. That story next. At this point, you can probably recite the official story about DACA by heart. DACA recipients are dreamers, the best America has to offer. They're all future scientists and humanitarians. If anything, you ought to be deported in their place. Well, meet 21-year-old DACA recipient Abigail Hernandez. She was recently arrested for making terroristic threats, allegedly, against high school students. She posted, apparently on Facebook 2 weeks ago, that she would go to East High School in Rochester, New York, and, quote, shoot all y'all, expletives. Sadly, we imagine this arrest could hurt her otherwise excellent chances of winning a Nobel Prize, but we'll keep you posted. Meanwhile, out in California, in Oakland, the mayor is an open insurrection against the federal government, not exaggerating. On Saturday, Democratic Mayor Libby Schaaf issued a press release warning locals that, based on several of her sources, she believed ICE, the Federal Immigration Administration, was about to launch immigration raids in the city of Oakland. The press release advised illegal residents to, quote, prepare, not panic, and advised them that business owners and schools were not allowed to assist ICE. Cesar Vargas is an illegal immigrant. He works as a lawyer in New York City, and he joins us tonight. Mr. Vargas, thanks for coming on.
Tucker, thank you so much for having me.
So how can a state actively work against federal law? Isn't that kind of how we had a civil war?
Well, what's the problem? Do we have a problem that a local city is protecting its residents? A local city is pushing against the overbearing power of the federal government? You know, the mayor is not saying, let's protect the rapists, let's protect the child molesters. The mayor is simply saying, we're going to protect our residents, regardless of their immigration status. We're going to protect our hardworking residents.
Hold on. Let me just be clear. I'm not attacking any of the so-called DACA recipients, people here illegally. Personally, I don't know them. Maybe some are bad people. Maybe they're all great people. But the point is they're here illegally in violation of federal law. California is a state. The state of California is not allowed to actively subvert federal law. Then it's not really acting in concert with the other 49 states. That's an active insurrection. Am I missing something?
Well, the Constitution does provide basic rights, but the Constitution allows the states to create more rights for their residents. Here, we're seeing the city of Oakland providing more rights to its residents, and not necessarily saying we're going to detain you, we're going to deport you. If you're working hard, you can stay here. Anyone who's committed a crime, ICE can still operate in Oakland
now you're getting into now you're getting into what we want to be true. I'm just saying what is true. Here's what is true as of now, and until Congress acts, it's going to be true. No, the Constitution has been interpreted by the Supreme Court for more than 200 years to say that states cannot act against federal law. That is one of the oldest precepts in American law. And if you say you're a lawyer, I'm sure you know that. So the point I'm making is this. These people are here illegally. Congress can change that. They can legalize them if they want. But right now, their presence is in violation of federal law. The mayor of an American city is saying you may not participate with federal law enforcement. You have to oppose federal law. That is not workable. You can't have that. That is an act of insurrection against the federal government. Do you see this? Do you care?
Well,
do you know what I mean?
Just because it's federal law doesn't mean it's right, doesn't mean it's constitutional. The Supreme Court has ruled, and federal courts have ruled, that one, the president does not have the authority to use racial discrimination to target immigrants. One, it's unconstitutional for the president to target sanctuary cities by defunding their government.
You're actually missing.
The federal
neither
courts
one of
have
them.
against
I'm sorry, I can't let
search
you.
and seizures from ICE targeting immigrants.
Look, I don't want to check your bar license or something, but
protects immigrants as well.
Okay. The federal government has a right to enforce federal law. Federal immigration law has not been overturned by the Supreme Court. Please don't make up facts on the show. Those laws are still enforced. And the federal government, by definition, has a right to enforce them. The states do not have a right to subvert them. There's no argument about that. So what you're seeing is something that cannot stand. I mean, the federal government in previous decades has sent federal troops into states when they do stuff like this. So do you understand the fire that they're playing with, or is it just it's cool because you think illegals should be able to stay here?
No,
that seems to be your core position.
I just think that throughout the judiciary history, we have shown that the states and the cities are the laboratory of democracy. The states have such power to do much more than the federal government has done. And what we're seeing here is the city saying, we're going to push it back against our overbearing government. We have done that. The king
You're getting
used
your
to
bumper
intervene
stickers
in the
confused.
colonial
That's
war.
like
And that's
whatever.
why you
The
had,
colonial.
okay,
I'm sorry.
And look at this.
I'm sorry.
We
I'm not
fought
allowing you to teach American history on my show
king,
because you failed the
violating
course.
the rights of, colonists. And that's why we had a colonial war. We had a revolutionary because we pushed against a tyrant. We pushed against unlawful laws
I mean, no offense,
that violated the rights of
I
our
wish you wouldn't say
people.
we. Hold on. Since you're not a citizen, actually, so you don't get to say we. I'm sorry, you just don't.
Well, I'm an American. Citizenship does not make me an American.
And
I think values make you what it means to be an American.
I don't know who told you that that's... No, actually, you become an American when you become an American citizen. That's the definition of it. I'm not attacking you as a person. I'm sure you're a great person.
Of course.
I'm sure you're smart. We're just different in that I'm an American and you're not. And that's just a legal question.
We're both Americans, though.
Right. No, that's not true. But let me ask you this, though. So Oakland's got all these other problems. And I'm not staying up late at night worried about whether illegal aliens get arrested in Oakland. Okay, I'm not, to be honest. What I'm really worried about, though, is the people who run Oakland care more about people there illegally than they care about the thousands of homeless that live on their streets. The hundreds of homeless children. The UN went to Oakland and said, this is cruelty what you're doing to your homeless. And yet they're spending time and money on behalf of people who aren't even allowed to be here. Do you see a kind of weird priority in that?
Well, I don't see a weirdness that the city of Oakland is protecting all its residents, regardless of their immigration status. What we're seeing now, if you want to talk about homeless people, well, I'm talking about the Trump tax reform that's benefiting the wealthy and the 1% and give them more tax break. That tax break should go into helping those homeless people. Should be going to help them into
that's so
our
silly. I'm beginning to think I don't think you should become a citizen. I mean, no offense or anything. It's not. I would be happy to have dinner with you, but
let's
that's
go for dinner
not
in a nice Mexican restaurant.
Not a very smart point. Caesar, thank you for joining us. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Tucker, for having me.
The Democrats' answer to the Nunes memo is out. What is in it? It's confusing, but we're going to explain it for you next. Well, the Democrats have now released their own memo on the FBI, Russia, and the Trump campaign. The memo's release comes 2 weeks after it was initially blocked by the administration, which said it contained some classified information. What does the memo actually say, in case you haven't read it? Someone who has is Fox News chief national correspondent Ed Henry, who joins us tonight. Hey, Ed.
Tucker, great to see you. Adam Schiff made some bold predictions about how his memo was going to blow the Republican memo out of the water. Hasn't exactly panned out. Remember, Republican Devin Nunes revealed in his memo released February 2nd, the Obama FBI and Justice Department relied on the unverified dossier without revealing its connections to the Democratic Party to conduct surveillance of a Trump advisor. Well, on February 2nd, Schiff put out a statement bitterly complaining the, quote, full truth was not being told because the Dem memo was blocked. Well, Schiff suggested the first FISA application to surveil Carter Page was not largely based on that dossier crafted by former British spy Christopher Steele. He said in a February 2nd statement, Schiff, quote, the majority suggests that the FBI failed to alert the court as to Mr. Steele's potential political motivations or the political motivations of those who hired him. But he said that is not accurate, except this new Democratic memo admits, contrary to that statement, the FBI and Justice Department did not reveal to the FISA court that the Steele info was paid for by the DNC and the Hillary Clinton campaign. It does not disprove the Nunes claim that former FBI Deputy Director Andrew McCabe testified to the House Intel panel they could not have gotten the approval to spy on Page without the dossier. And finally, it does not disprove the Nunes claim that the dossier was relied on heavily to get not just one, but a total of 4 warrants against Page. Nevertheless, Schiff still claims that there was some independent verification that led to the approval, and he also says that Steele was a trusted source. Well, Republican Jason Chaffetz today fired back that Steele wouldn't even qualify to be in an Austin Powers movie, let alone be the basis for such a serious thing as surveillance of an American citizen. Tucker?
Ed Henry, thanks a million, Ed.
Good to see you.
Molly Hemingway is senior editor at The Federalist and has looked deeply into this. She joins us tonight. Molly, there are so many memos, it's getting confusing. But I guess a central question, and Ed had a quick take on it, was, after the Nunes memo, was the Steele dossier, the BuzzFeed document that is mostly unproved even now, was that the basis for these FISA court requests for surveillance?
You know, it's funny because a year ago, if you said that you were worried that this BuzzFeed dossier, this Russia, salacious document, might have been used to secure a wiretap against an American citizen, you might have sounded crazy.
Yes, that's true.
Now we have multiple, and just this latest one is this Democratic memo that confirms, in fact, this dossier was used to secure a wiretap against a Trump campaign affiliate. It's a pretty big story.
Wait, so the Schiff memo, the one that was going to blow up the Nunes memo and make us realize that Trump was a Russian agent, confirms that the Steele dossier was used to get the wiretap?
Yeah, so the way that the Democrats say it is they admit that it was used. They say it was a narrow use, but then the actual bulk of their own memo shows that it was a huge portion, that the claim that Carter Page went to Moscow to meet secretly with Russians, that was a key part of the application to secure this wiretap.
Does the new memo knock down any of the claims from the Nunes memo, do you think?
Well, I mean, the one thing that I think actually is to their benefit in their memo is that they say that the FISA application that it included a portion about Carter Page's history. And when the Republicans put out their memo, they didn't put that in there. And so that's a solid thing to say. But overall, there are many things that they actually confirm what that original House Republican memo said. And it's worth remembering that it wasn't just the House Republican Intel Committee memo. It's also now Senate investigators came to the same conclusion, agreeing with that Nunes memo, that there was FISA abuse. One of the interesting things about this new memo that came out is that for a year we've been told that this dossier was so important, it was so key. You know, it was strategically leaked by key Obama intel people to legitimize it and say it was being taken seriously. And after a year of having it be so much a part of our news cycle, I mean, Adam Schiff and other people were reading it into the record, when they would have testimony and hearings. Now they're saying, oh, it wasn't a big deal. It wasn't a big deal at all. This is a dramatic turnaround, which suggests that they do not believe that the dossier is worth standing beside or standing behind. And in fact, we have been hearing from so many people that it is unverified and that the bulk of it is, other than what was publicly reported, has not been confirmed.
Am I misremembering this, or is John McCain the one who first brought that dossier to the FBI?
It is a misremembering because the dossier was already in the FBI's hands. What we learned from one of the people who created the dossier, he gave Senate testimony to the Senate Judiciary Committee, there were sort of two dossier operations. One was during the campaign, and when that didn't accomplish the goal of keeping Donald Trump from being elected, they ran a separate dossier operation to try and get it into the hands of James Comey and other high-level FBI officials. And that was where Senator John McCain became key, sending his associate to get the memo and get it back into the hands of the FBI, where it could be further weaponized more as a media operation then.
Man, when you take on the establishment, there are costs, I would say.
There are, and there's a lot more that remains to be seen in this, and much more investigation that needs to happen.
Thank you for guiding us through that. I appreciate it. Texas just wrapped up its state high school wrestling tournament. For the second year in a row, a transgender person took the title. Our high school sports just another venue for left-wing science experiments. And whatever happened to girls' sports? Are they over thanks to this? Mark Stein joins us to explain next. The state wrestling championship in Texas just wrapped up for the second year in a row. The women's class 6A 110-pound division was won by Mac Beggs. Mac, that's right, although biologically female, Mac is transitioning to male, and as part of that transition takes testosterone and steroids. But Mac still competes as a girl because Texas rules require school athletes to compete as the gender on their birth certificate. If that's not confusing enough, well, it is, and that's why we asked Mark Stein to come and join us to explain it. So, Mark, this seems like, and I think it's worth being paranoid about every new development because they always are slippery slope, actually, despite claims to the contrary.
Right.
But why is girls' sports not over? Boys have a massive physical, biological advantage in a lot of sports, and if you allow boys to compete as girls, then what happens to girls?
Well, there is no girls' sports then. But you're right. Just to go back to what you said, Tucker, this may seem trivial and the slippery slope. It isn't actually. I would say this is actually one of the biggest stories of our time, perhaps the biggest, bigger than the budget deficit or whatever. You used the word gender in the introduction. In my day, we used to talk about the sexes, and when I was a schoolboy, it would say name, date of birth, place of birth, sex, and every errant schoolboy would put sex, yes please, and it was a standard schoolboy joke, and we all tittered. And all the girls put sex, female, and that was how it was divided. And somewhere along the way, the word sex, the two sexes, were abolished and replaced by the word gender. And in the course of that, we lost not just a great schoolboy joke, but in a sense, we lost that clear distinction. And so we have replaced the two biological sexes with a multiplicity of genders. And the abolition of the sexes is, in fact, not a small thing. And the point of this wrestling competition, Texas has responded to some of these modish fancies by saying, no, only biological girls can compete in girls' sports and biological boys. And this is a way of just saying, well, whatever you do, whatever laws you pass to protect traditional sex roles and girls' sports and boys' sports, we're going to ride a coach and horses through it anyway, and you're done and it's over. It is one of the biggest stories of our time.
Well, I agree with that, and I think it has profound influence. That's why we always do the story, not for any prurient reason, but because the way that men and women get along is the basis of society, and it's nothing's more important than that. But I'm fascinated by the idea that a small group of people can determine what the rest of us are allowed to say out loud about even biology. We're now required to lie about biology, and we're punished if we don't. And how did that happen? No one really believes this. Only about 8 people do, and they're in control. How?
Well, I think that's the other fascinating thing. You know, if you're a climate skeptic, then the left demonize you and say you're anti-science. But we are actually abolishing biology in a lot of this. I mean, what I find interesting about this is, as you say, there's only 8 people who actually believe all this. However many people believe it, they're the people who matter in the United States and in Canada and Europe and every other advanced society. So, for example, if I were to misgender this girl who's transitioning into a boy, there would be a Twitter storm about how I'd misgendered him or her, and that was disgraceful. And celebrities get hounded into apologizing profusely for this. The fact is, this girl transitioning into a boy is on drugs that increase her strength and has just ruined the girls' state championship for all the undrugged, unsteroided girl wrestlers. And what I particularly resent about this story, Tucker, is the loss of seemliness in our society. If somebody wants to transition into a boy or transition into a girl, great. But maybe that means you have to give up the wrestling, that you can't have everything, that you should take up the violin instead, not wreck a sport, not wreck a statewide sport for all the other participants.
It's deep and true. Mark Stein, thank you, as always, for that. That was great.
Thanks a lot, Tucker.
Violent crime is down, believe it or not, but rampage shooters are getting more common, and it's really hurting the country, in case you haven't noticed. The question is, why is it happening? Professor Jordan Peterson has an idea, and he joins us with that next. Well, compared to the rates in the 80s and early 90s, crime overall is down in this country, but rampage shooters are increasingly common, and they're killing more people, obviously. Almost all of them are young men. The question, which for some reason very few people ask, but is the key question, is what's driving this surge in extreme antisocial violence? One man who's been thinking about it a lot is Jordan Peterson. He's a psychology professor at the University of Toronto, and he just spoke with us moments ago. Here it is. Jordan Peterson, thanks for joining us tonight.
My pleasure.
We wanted to ask you the question that we think too few are asking, which is, why is this happening? Why are young men shooting up schools?
Because they're nihilistic and desperate.
How'd they get that way?
Well, I think life can make you that way unless you have a purpose and a destiny, let's say. I mean, there's no shortage of suffering and malevolence in life, and it's easy for people to become embittered by that. And if they don't see a way out, see a way forward, they get angry about it and turn against life itself. And they make a display of their hatred for being by massacring the innocent. That's what's happening. And they write that.
They do write that. It's accelerating.
Yes.
The reserve of guns has, I mean, we've had semi-automatic rifles for 100 years, but we haven't had this number of school shootings. So the attitudes are changing, I think it's fair to say. Why
it's
are
also
more...
It's also kind of a psychological epidemic. You know, these people keep track of each other, and there's a competitive element to it. And the fact that the media insists upon publicizing the names of these shooters is not helpful, because part of what drives them is motivation for notoriety. Because notoriety is better than being ignored.
So what mistakes do you think we're making as a society to produce an ever-increasing number of young men like this?
That's a good question. I think we underestimate the necessity for young people to have clear direction and a sense of purpose in their life. They need something to offset the tragedy and malevolence of life. And we need to take these sorts of philosophical and even religious issues seriously, but we don't.
Do you think we're taking them less seriously than we used to?
Yes, definitely. I think that we talked in the past, we spoke much more about responsibility and responsibility in particular, but also purpose and maturity, and we valued those things highly. We didn't confuse them with tyranny and toxic masculinity, for example.
Speaking of toxic why is it all boys?
Well, boys are more aggressive than girls. And there's a biological component to that that's quite strong. That's why the vast majority of people in prison are male. Like on average, there's not much difference in aggression between men and women. If you picked a random woman and a random man out of the population and you had to bet on who was the most aggressive, if you bet it was the woman, you'd be right 40% of the time. But if you take the 1 in 100 most aggressive people, and those would be the people in prison, they're all men, or virtually all men. It's also why males attempt suicide less frequently, but they commit it successfully much more frequently. They're much more likely to use lethal means. And there's a very powerful biological component to that, despite what the postmodern social constructionists have to say about it. But they've got their head firmly buried in the sand, so...
Yeah, no, they're resistant to the evidence and reality. We know that. So, but given that we know that boys are the ones, if there is a school shooting, who are going to be the ones committing it overwhelmingly, shouldn't we be thinking about how to raise our boys in a way that they're less likely to do this?
Yeah, I think we should be thinking about that. I mean, the book I published here, this 12 Rules for Life, is a meditation on exactly that. I've been lecturing online about the idea that responsibility is what gives life meaning, and that meaning is the antidote to the sort of nihilism and aggression and resentment that can otherwise be produced. I mean, there's no doubt that life is difficult and that people get hurt and betrayed. That's unassailable truth. You need something to offset that, and most people find that in their destiny, in their adoption of responsibility, and their willingness to make their own lives better and the lives of their families better, and to contribute to the community and to bear the burden of being nobly. And that works, but we don't think that way anymore.
You mentioned the toxic masculinity. I'm not exactly sure what that means, but I've heard the phrase a lot. What does it mean in our public conversation when someone attributes the shooting to toxic masculinity?
Well, it's an attempt to smear the idea of masculinity by confusing masculine competence with tyranny. And it's part of the underlying idea that our culture is a corrupt, tyrannical patriarchy that was run by men for the advantage of men, which is a very pathological way of looking at the world, but a very common one. And if that description is accepted, then it means that masculine energy, so to speak, whether it's manifested by women or by men, that masculine energy does nothing but prop up the tyranny of the patriarchy. And so should not be fostered. And the only people who think that way are women whose relationships with men have been extraordinarily damaged, or men who have no idea who they are or who are trying to shirk responsibility. The idea that masculinity in its essence is somehow toxic is an absolutely dreadful idea.
I'm glad I asked you that question. Jordan Peterson, thank you. Chicago Mayor Rahm Emanuel wants another term, but he probably won't get it with his existing constituents. So what's his plan for holding on to power? He's got one. We'll tell you what it is coming up.